All right, we'll go ahead and get going. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to join us for the Axosoft Scrum webinar. My name is Jonathan Silva. I'm joined here by Brett Goldman. Both of us are from the Axosoft Customer Success. I'm in charge of training. I'm one of the certified Scrum Masters here at Axosoft. Brett Goldman here is a head of support. And if you are Axosoft customers, you may have either heard my voice from some of the training videos we've done here on YouTube. You may have talked to Brett or myself for some support questions you may have had. And so this is a webinar that we like to do pretty frequently here at Axosoft. And so we thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Okay, so that being said, who is this webinar for? So as the invitation may have us explained, this is an introduction to Scrum. What we wanted to do was provide something that's approachable, informal, just something that, Scrum itself is very it can be non-technical. It doesn't have to be applied directly to software development, even though that is where it comes from. If you're here joining us and you're looking to apply some principles from Scrum in perhaps a different industry, a different environment, then that's what it's for. It's here to be adapted. So if you are someone who does apply Scrum or Agile principles on a daily basis, then this will serve as a great refresher. I mean, it's always good to go over some of the basics so you can look at it through a new light, use your own experiences to perhaps draw different meanings from things that you were already introduced to in the past. And then if you're new, then hopefully this will provide a different perspective than from some of the online or other whatever media you've been consuming, just a different perspective to kind of figure out, well, what's this Scrum thing all about? So today's agenda is we're going to cover 4 things mainly, but it's going to start out with just values from the Agile manifesto, and then we'll dive into what the Scrum roles are. So there's 3 distinct Scrum roles that the framework recognizes. And then once we go over those 2 things, we'll dive into the actual framework itself. So we'll talk about the 5 Scrum activities that are outlined in the framework, and perhaps touch on a few other tangents here or there as well. And then finally, if time permits, we'll go over an example of how you can organize your product backlog using a tool. And since we're from Axosoft and we're slightly biased, we'll go ahead and use our own Axosoft tool. It's just what we have on hand. Of course, you don't have to use Axosoft, but this is just what we'll use for the example. And then following that, we'll dive into Q&A. So that's the agenda for today. Please feel free to hop in and out as you need, but we'd love and very much appreciate if you could stay for the whole thing. Hopefully my voice doesn't bore you to death. So here we go. All right, so the Agile manifesto. So this is where many Agile methodologies came from the 12 principles and the 4 values that were derived here in the Agile manifesto. And really what it was is just 17 gentlemen who got together at a Utah resort. Some sources will probably make it sound, in the later 20th century, a handful of developers, blah, 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 blah. Really, they just got together because they were very frustrated with some of the heavyweight project management styles or methodologies that were being implemented in the day. And so really, this is code word for waterfall. Waterfall being very meticulous, demanding a lot of documentation, demanding a lot of time, overhead. It's pretty easy to understand how things can get frustrating for folks. And so they were gathering together to discuss lightweight methods. So what are some lightweight methodologies that we can start implementing to make our lives a little easier while still improving the product for the sake of the customer? And so there are 4 values that I want to go over that touch on the origins of Scrum. And so the first one, and I have these all labeled in Italian, I hope you don't mind, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And so think of this as a scale. It's not to say that processes and tools aren't important. The key word here is over. And so we want to promote, as much as possible, people actually talking to one another, exchanging ideas, challenging ideas, questioning, rather than making sure that people are just following the process for the sake of the process or putting everything in the tool because that's the way we've always done it. So, we're just challenging you to actually use your human mind, to think, to interact, to be social, and to challenge things. So that's the first principle here. The next one is working software over comprehensive documentation. So a slight tangent here. So even though I will be going into what the Scrum framework will look like, if your team is already able to get software out the door at a reasonable time, on a time frame, then there's really no need to overhaul the process that you have right now and to implement something new that is quite unknown and would probably get you fired if you try to do too much at the same time. Just to be perfectly frank, based off of feedback I've gotten from other folks here. But what you can do is take the principles that we talk about and apply them, where it makes sense. So anyway, the point here is that you want to make sure that your software works and that it's, out the door to the customer in a reasonable time frame. And the principle here, though, is coming from in the heavyweight days where documentation was made for documentation's sake. You may have heard that phrase before, where you would essentially develop tomes of texts that were never maintained, that were a burden to, house and really serve no purpose. It is still important, however, to understand what the code is supposed to do. And so it's not to say that you shouldn't, mark your code with comments. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't at least put some document together that briefly outlines what you guys did, or what the team did, I should say, just so that any new face who goes into the code and tries to make sense of it can go ahead and do so without wasting so much time and reworking. All right, third principle, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. This is when I dive into the product owner role, this is where this principle is coming into play. And so getting constant customer feedback, because understanding their needs is ultimately where you're going to succeed in the marketplace, where you're able to identify needs, where you're able to see that there are certain needs in the market that aren't being satisfied by the current offerings. And so being able to understand your customer and getting that input into your product will be key. Now, another tangent here. If any of you went to the Business of Software conference, you may have talked to Tony Ulwick from Stratogen. And so his talk was something that just stood out to me because it touched on the idea of outcome-driven innovation. That's the phrase there. And so he was identifying these needs based off, like, when you look at your customers, who's actually doing the job? So, for example, if I were since we are a project management, company, who's actually doing the job? Well, the developers and also the project managers. And so our job is try to make that as easy as possible for whoever's executing the job. And so the talk is available just on the Business of Software website if you're interested. Again, his name is Tony Ulwick. His last name is Ulwick. I always like to plug in talks that I've encountered just because I feel it's good information to spread around. And finally, here we go. Responding to change over following a plan. This is the whole principle of Agile. Agile, Scrum, you'll hear themes of teamwork, of inspection, and adapting. So the ability to, reflect on your actual progress, of being honest with the team's progress, with your own progress, your own contributions, and being able to accept when things must change. The problem with waterfall is it focuses heavily on planning everything towards the beginning. And really, in the beginning is when you have the worst amount of information. It really doesn't make any sense why folks would do that. And then, especially when I tried doing one waterfall project, we planned everything in the beginning only to find out in the second phase that everything we did in the first phase was wrong, and we had to go back and rework everything. It's quite frustrating, quite demoralizing. What Scrum and Agile in general tries to do is to try to roll everything into get feedback early rather than towards the end, so that you can take the feedback and adapt quickly so that you get what folks are looking for from the get-go. Okay, so these are the 4 values of the Agile manifesto. Just wanted to touch on it quickly so you have a great foundation as we move forward into what Scrum actually is. So what is Scrum? So before I dive into the roles, just, let's try answering that question of what is Scrum. And I touched on what a heavyweight method is. Well, Scrum would be a lightweight method. It's a lightweight framework for small teams to tackle complex problems. And so it's just something that they developed. It's an idea. You don't have to follow it to the letter. In fact, most people don't. And they usually just take the principles that make the most sense and apply it to their environment, to their company. I mean, each of you is coming from a different organization with its own history, its own context, its own people. How you apply it is going to be different than how another organization applies it, and how some organizations have success with it will be different than your own path to success. But there are things that you can all do to kind of get your ball rolling. And the first one is to have 3 distinct roles for your Scrum team. And it all starts out with the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master, who is this person? So Scrum Master is not a project manager, so that's something to keep in mind. This is not a command and control relationship. The Scrum Master is a peer among all the other members of the Scrum team. They're there to guide people. Think of him as Gandalf or her as the Gandalf of your team of the fellowship. There's 9 of them, right? They're a servant leader. They facilitate the Scrum process, so they're the ones who know basically how everything is supposed to go, and they're the go-to person to answer those questions of wait, how long is this meeting supposed to be, or wait, what's the next phase in the Scrum process? Um, and they're also coaching the team to work better with one another, and so it's an important thing here because when you first form your Scrum team or you first form a dev team or even when you hire someone new, you have to start from the beginning just because people have to understand how to work with one another. People have to understand what skills are within the whole team, and what capacity people, how much work can each person take, and so that takes time. And even one sprint is not enough to get that, get a team to be a cohesive unit. And so if any of you are familiar with Tuckman's stages of group development, it's quite simplistic, but it's simplistic and easy to remember, even though people are complex and difficult to understand. You can still use a framework to kind of get the idea of how you can move people through a better teamwork. So what I mean to say is that it all starts out when the team forms together, so the forming stage. And then there's the storming stage where people finally start showing their true colors or they start to disagree. Doesn't mean that they come to blows or anything, but they do finally challenge one another and they aren't afraid of, positioning themselves in any sort of power play here. And then once the storming phase is over, hopefully it ends, then the team starts to norm. And then finally the team will begin to perform when it understands itself better. Once a team reaches a performing stage, it doesn't really need a Scrum Master anymore, but that's another webinar in itself. And then one thing I didn't mention here, the impediment bulldozer. I just like that term in general. I found it in a Scrum, a breathtaking brief and agile introduction. It's a book that I got from one of the conferences here in the States. But it's just it means what it says. The Scrum Master is also the one who's primarily tasked with removing any obstacles that the team faces. And so, if you need stuff from IT, then they're the person who's going to go get it. If there is a resource deficit, they're the ones who are going to interface with HR or whoever would be the person to go hire the individual. So anything where the Scrum team has to interface with someone else outside in the organization, but outside the Scrum team, the Scrum Master is a person who will go ahead and take care of those duties. So I hope that makes sense. So now that we've touched on the Scrum Master, we'll touch on the second role, which is the product owner. And so the product owner is the person who is primarily tasked with bringing in a return on investment for the company. And so they want to make sure that they minimize the opportunity cost as much as possible. So the dev team, the Scrum team's time should be spent on activities that will derive the most value for the company and for the customer. And so it is up to the product owner to determine the business value of all of those things that people are requesting. So, and we'll get to that, those user stories, those feature requests in the product backlog. But they're the ones who are in charge of managing that. And so you can call them the product visionary, the person who has an idea of what the customer needs and how to best satisfy that within the means of what the Scrum team can do. They're the ones representing the voice of the customer, so always bringing up, well, that's a great feature idea, but the customer will not be able to understand X, Y, and Z, so on and so forth. They are the ones who can determine the rank of the items inside the product backlog. So I'll get to what the product backlog is in a few moments. But this is the individual who will be making sure that either items are cut, added, merged, subtracted. I'll get to that in a sec. It's in an activity called backlog grooming. And then if you have a question about, well, who should be my product owner, we do have a suggestion. This is something I learned from my Scrum training. And that's this AKA that you're seeing. So it's really 3 things. You want a product owner who has authority. So typically someone in an organization like a VP or an executive has the authority to actually determine what will go into the product, what will be released to the customer base. If someone is unable to make those types of decisions, if they're held, if they always are beholden to someone else when making those decisions, then their ability to actually be an effective product owner will be slightly compromised. And so you want someone who has the authority to actually fulfill the duties that is stated in the product owner role. The next thing you want is someone with knowledge, the K. So someone who has actual knowledge of the industry that you guys are serving. So whoever your customer base is, this person, this individual, this one single person, you shouldn't have more than one product owner, should have a pretty either years of experience or just a pretty much deep understanding of your customer. So if you're in project management, that they understand that industry. If you're in accounting software, then you understand the needs of that industry. If you're serving your market to chefs, then you should understand that as well. And so authority, knowledge, and lastly, those two would be useless if this product owner is not available. So whoever this individual is must be available for the Scrum team just to answer those basic questions. The product owner is the one who's saying this feature must be done within this next sprint because of X, Y, and Z reasons. But if the Scrum team is unable to ask, well, did you mean it to look like this? Do you mean it to be like this? If the product owner is unable to answer those questions just because they're either unavailable or they're always busy, then they're not going to be a very effective product owner. So again, those three things are the authority to actually execute on the duties, the knowledge to understand the customer base, and the availability to actually help the Scrum team and actually fulfill the role. So I like the product owner role. I think it's really fascinating just because of how much they depend on actually getting feedback from the customer. And of course, the most integral part of the Scrum team is the dev team member. So the folks, the professionals who are actually developing the product and creating something. So the dev team is comprised of a myriad of skills. So within the dev team, you have to make sure that all the skills that you need to successfully address all the items in your product backlog are there. So if you need someone to be a SQL expert and another person to be an HTML and CSS expert, basically the team itself has all the skills that you need. So that is something to keep in mind when you're looking for folks to be part of your Scrum team. Not only are you looking for someone to be a culture fit, but you want to make sure that the skills that they have or bring to the table complement the needs of the Scrum team. So a few things about the dev team. So the dev team also plays an integral role. So where the product owner is the one deciding the order of what items will be in the product backlog, the dev team is the one that actually decides what will make it into the sprint in terms of they will have to respect the order of the product owner, but they can't take if the product owner sets 20 things as number one, then the dev team understands that they can only do maybe a handful of those. And so there's always this line of respect between the product owner and the dev team. The Scrum Master, of course, is making sure that those things are communicated between the two. But just understand that the dev team does have some say, and they do have, for example, they're the only ones who could really provide any estimate on how long something will take, just because they're the ones who are actually performing, who are creating the product. So this is your entire Scrum team. Oh, no, I guess I had another slide. So they create the product, they're self-organized. They work together as a team. They don't fall into this whole silo trap of that's not my job. That's Jeff's job. He's the one who does HTML or CSS. No, they work together. They're all responsible for making sure that the items that they all agreed to complete at the end of the sprint are met. And if not, it's okay to fail, but they all just work together to make sure that everything comes together towards the end. So this is your Scrum team. As a rule of thumb, Scrum teams typically range from 7 people plus or minus 2 people. So as little as 5, as many as 9. Of course, you don't have to listen to us if you can do whatever you want. But we just noticed that if you go 5 or under, that you may not have all the skills that you need to actually meet the needs of the product backlog, the needs of the customer. But if you have too many, then communication starts to suffer and you run into a lot of overhead. And so those are just things to keep in mind. Remember, you're trying to stay agile so that you respond to change as quickly as possible. Okay, so we've touched on roles, and now we're going to get into the actual framework. And so what I'm about to present to you, I have a simple graphic here, but this is a combination of the product of artifacts, Scrum artifacts, and Scrum artifacts is just a fancy buzzword that means this is how I'm going to show people how we're doing. So this is how you provide visibility to everyone else and your team of how things are going. And then I have a couple Scrum activities here that are part of the Scrum process. So hopefully by the end of this segment here, you'll have a pretty good idea of what the Scrum process entails. And so it all starts out with what I've been alluding to this whole time, the product backlog, which is essentially a wish list of all the items, of all the feature requests that people from your customers, from your internal team, from you yourself and your brilliant mind have come together to, like, this is what the product should be, and this is what will make it amazing. Now, how do folks usually go about filling up the product backlog? Well, the most popular approach is the user story approach, and you've probably heard of this, but it's basically a way of getting 3 pieces of information into the product backlog automatically. You're defining who a user story or feature request is for. You're actually explaining what the feature is, and you're outlining what the benefit, the return on investment for the customer or yourselves will be. And so those are 3 key pieces of information. Some folks put it in the title, some folks include it in some other part of the, depending on how you actually make them. I've seen teams use actual paper cards and paste them on the wall. If you use Axosoft, then you can just dive into the tool and edit the item. But in any case, however you decide to do it, you end up with a lot of them, and you don't really know what to do first. And so this is where the product owner comes into play. So the product owner is the individual who is managing this entire backlog, who's trying to make sense of it. And they go through an activity that's called backlog refinement. And so backlog refinement is where they're deciding what items have the most business value and will make it into the subsequent sprints or releases. And I'll get to what sprints and releases are in a moment. But what we want to focus on is deciding what items are important. And so this is typically what the backlog refinement entails. The product owner is going through the product backlog, all the feature requests, and they're either taking out or minimizing or demoting items that just aren't important anymore, which is important to do, otherwise your backlog gets a little unwieldy. They, of course, add all the feature requests that have been coming in from the customer base, from your team, or from anywhere else. They're splitting items that perhaps are too large and either require other things to be developed first, or just need to be broken down for easier digestion. They're merging items that are the same and potentially doing a rough estimate of how long something will take. Now, again, the product owner will probably need the help of the dev team to make those estimations. It's really up to you. If you want to have rough estimations just to have an idea of how long something may take, it might help you actually plan out your sprints, and by all means, go ahead and do so. But these are typically the activities that are ongoing. So this is the product owner is always doing this. There's no one time where the product owner is never doing this. It should be something that's ongoing, as you're probably always getting feature requests. You're probably always getting a better idea of what your product can do to serve the customer base better. Okay, so you've gone through, at least, you've been refining your backlog, and you have a pretty good idea of what items derive the most value. So you see green check marks here. So these are the items that I've decided will make it into my release backlog. Okay, so here's where we somewhat diverge from other frameworks. So frameworks, you may have seen, just dive straight into the sprint backlog. And by all means, you can do that if you'd like. What we do here is we put an in-between step. So we put a release backlog in between the product backlog and the sprint backlog. So it's the medium step. Just because we understand that some teams like to have either quarterly releases, or they like to have releases that are, every 70 days or so on and so forth. A release is just a time box. It's just a start date and a due date of when you want to develop and release what you have developed. And so you're welcome to just jump straight to the sprint backlog. So in my case, I would just do the same thing over again, where I would go through and look at the items inside the release backlog and select the items that will make it into the sprint backlog. And this is a Scrum activity that is called sprint planning. So the sprint planning meeting answers these key questions. What work will be done? And this is a meeting that has to be, of course, the dev team has to attend. The product owner has to be available, but they probably should be in attendance, since these are questions that clarify what the user stories actually are, what the product needs to look like. These are things that the product owner should be there for. And the Scrum Master, of course, can be there to facilitate and make sure that things are going smoothly. And as a rule of thumb, for every week, so say you've decided that you do 2-week sprints, and you do quarterly releases. And so let's see, that's maybe about 6 sprints in one release. And so for every release planning meeting that you have, a sprint planning meeting, you have about 2 hours, 1 to 2 hours for every week of the sprint. So for 2 week sprint, that's about 2 to 4 hour meeting where you answer these three questions. So the dev team looks at the product backlog that the product owner has refined, and they say, okay, of the things that you've told us, we'll go ahead and work on these things because that's what we can take within the next 2 weeks. That meets our capacity. And by also answering the question of how will the work be done, they may actually get a better idea of how long something will take. And so what resources are required, what skills are required, how can we solve this problem? And so both of these questions will take discussion. Both of these questions will, once they are answered, will help define the user stories even better. And you get two more pieces of information. So you get the actual estimate of how long something will take, in addition to what the user story is for, what the actual feature is, and what the actual benefit is. And the last thing that you get is what some folks call acceptance criteria. We call it the definition of done. And so you just have to give your developers something to shoot for, an actual goal. When are they actually done? Software has a bad habit of expanding to whatever time frame you give it. And so, something that could be done in 2 days can take a week if you let someone take a week. And so it's just something to be aware of. It's just a way for folks to be held accountable for, all right, when do I stop? And so you're answering these three questions during the sprint planning meeting. And then once you're all done, you have your sprint backlog. And this is where folks can actually start getting to work. Once you assign each of the cards out, each of the items out to the folks, and they can go ahead and begin getting to work. Okay, so going back to this graphic, we've touched on what the product backlog is, which is essentially a way for you to provide visibility to your team of all the feature requests, all the things of value that you need to get done. And in our case, we've broken it down into the release backlog, which is a smaller selection. And then we've broken the release backlog into even smaller selections called the sprint backlogs. And so now that the sprint has actually started, we dive into another sprint activity, which is called the daily stand-up. And in this graphic, looks like we've gone with 30-day sprints. Again, it's really up to you to decide how long you want your sprints to be. But the daily stand-up is not a report to the manager meeting. Okay, so this is a device, this is a tool for your dev team to communicate to one another. And this doesn't have to be just for your dev team. I mean, we at Customer Success have our own stand-ups every day just because it helps facilitate communication within the team. We just understand what everyone is doing. And we're answering, three major questions that help get that information across. What did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? And are you having any problems that you need help with? So the daily scrum is time boxed to 15 minutes. So it must be 15 minutes or less. The entire dev team, it's for the entire dev team. The product owner does not have to be there, but they do have to be available just to answer any questions. And the scrum master can go ahead and facilitate it. And then anything that does arise, so this last question, what problems are you having? These should be answered offline if it takes, more than a few minutes to answer within the meeting. Again, the whole point is just to help bring those issues to light. And then if it takes an offline meeting to go ahead and, take care of those things outside the daily scrum, then you're already getting those problems solved and you're not taking up everyone else's time. Remember, the whole point of this is to get people to work. They get into a rhythm and they figure out, okay, this is what we do every day. This is how I can bring up issues. They have a means to, something comes up, they have a means to actually act on it. So you do this over and over again every single day. Of course, you don't have to do the daily scrum every day. I know some teams who do it maybe every other day or once a week. It's really up to you. We recommend doing it every day just because it fosters better communication. But again, it's up to your team. But once the sprint is over, so here you get into all right, are we ready to release the product? So before you can release the product, you want to do another Scrum activity. And what we recommend doing is the sprint review, which is essentially a demo. And so this is your chance to invite stakeholders, managers, executives. It's where the dev team goes and demos all the features or all the items that was agreed upon in the sprint planning meeting. So in the sprint planning meeting, everyone decided we're going to do A, we're going to do B, and we're going to do C. And then in the actual sprint review, they're showing this is A. It looks great. We used cursive. This is B. We decided to go with bold. And then for C, we know we're going to do an underline, but we also included a strike through just in case. And then the stakeholders can go, ooh, that's amazing. Or they can give feedback to, say, no, that's not what we wanted, which is important feedback nonetheless because you want to understand where the failure occurred in the process. And so again, it follows the same rule of thumb. Usually the sprint review is about 1 hour for every week that the Scrum, however many weeks you have in the sprint. Honestly, for us though, we do it very, very quickly. We just have everyone together in one room. The dev goes through and shows off all the features, and we just have all our questions answered. So it's just a rule of thumb, but you can always adapt it. Okay. So you have the sprint review, you gotten the okay. The product owner is the one who finally releases the product. So if the product owner decides that what was the product that was produced within the sprint is of adequate quality, then that will be released to the customer base. And so they're the ones who are supposedly supposed to make the final say. And then once that's all done, the team gets together and they have a retrospective meeting where they analyze how things went in the last 2 weeks, where things went wrong and where things can improve. And so this is a pretty critical piece because what it's essentially doing, it's allowing you to inspect, to reflect, to open up, to be vulnerable, and to really examine yourselves and make sure that things are going well. And if things didn't go well, where things can improve. There are teams who have tried to implement Scrum and they didn't produce anything in the first couple of weeks. And so, this is critical then because they have to at least learn from what they did wrong so they can better perform for the following sprint or the following release. And so once you do that, you essentially rinse and repeat the whole process and it becomes a rhythm. And so hopefully by now you feel pretty comfortable here that, okay, these are the artifacts, product backlog, this is how I manage everything. I can break it down if I wish. The person who's managing the product backlog is a product owner. The Scrum Master is really the resource who understands all of this, and I can ask this person questions at all times. But they're also coaching my team and being the person on point to work with other parts of the organization to get the stuff that we need. And then of course we're working through sprints, one sprint at a time or one release at a time, to get the product out. We're making sure that we're bringing in the stakeholders and everyone in the sprint review, and we ship the product out and also understand what we did during the last sprint. So then you rinse and repeat all over again. And so this is why I mentioned that the backlog refinement activity is something that's always going on even during the sprint. The product owner is always meeting with customers or getting customer feedback or incorporating that into the product backlog so that for the next release or the next sprint, items are updated and the rank is updated as well. So you rinse and repeat, keep on going. That's Scrum basically in a nutshell for you. And so what I want to do next here just take 5 minutes just to kind of demo what this would look like, maybe with what would a product backlog look like? What would a release backlog look like and a sprint backlog? Those are just the things I want to focus on in particular. So what I'm going to do here is I'll share my other screen. There we go. Okay. So what you should see in front of you is, we're going to use Axosoft as an example. Hope you don't mind. But what you should see in front of you is our product backlog for a project we call PureChat. So PureChat is another, it's a sister company of Axosoft, and they develop just simple chat that you can put on your website. And it's really easy for folks who are maybe on eBay or on Craigslist or they're small businesses, and they just want to provide quick support to their customers. And so in any case, they have their wish list of items that they wish to include in the product. And so this is everything you see here in the product. It's massive, lots of items here. And this is what I designate as our product backlog. And so what PureChat has done is that they've broken it down into a smaller selection. So before I had over 90 items, now I have about 72 that are in this release backlog. It doesn't really look terribly different, but if I go to my sprint backlog where we've organized things even further, you'll see a smaller selection, something that's approachable, that the devs can actually take, assign, and move through a workflow and understand how things are going. And so hopefully that brings the idea home of the product backlog all the way down to the sprint backlog. You will need the product owner to go through and prioritize these items. And so in this case, I'm doing this in the sprint backlog. I really should be doing this in the product backlog. But your product owner can go through and rank items, edit them accordingly, include acceptance criteria, include information about who this is for. I'm not using user stories, for example, in this item, but if I wanted to, I can include that information. So as a support agent, I want to be able to communicate with my customers via chat in order to provide excellent customer service. And so just different things here. And then one other thing I wanted to demonstrate with Axosoft is something that we do here every day, at least the dev team for sure, is that they will go ahead and have the daily Scrum using the Axosoft daily Scrum feature. And so if I focus on, let's do the current sprint. So they'll put this up on a projector in one of our conference rooms. They will go ahead and start the timer. And then this just helps provide all the information that each dev needs to answer their questions. What did you do yesterday? Oh, I did that. What are you working on right now? The stuff on the right. And are you encountering any problems? I think I put a note down there. Oh yeah, that's what I was doing. That's the problem I was having. Hey, can you help me out with that? And so this is just one way of just facilitating, getting all the information you need for the daily Scrum. Again, you don't have to use Axosoft. You don't have to use this feature. If you're a small team, that perhaps using a whiteboard is sufficient. We're not here to put overhead on your head. What we want to do is make sure that the team has everything they need to be successful and be developing as much as possible and communicating between one another as much as possible. So that being said, let me hop back over to my other screen, and we'll now go ahead and dive into Q&A. So Brett, I've been hearing you furiously type over there. Are there any questions that have been coming in?
Yeah, so there's a couple. So for all of you who have actually been typing in questions, of course, thank you for getting this up. It's always good just to be able to address those right as they come up. I'm sorry. If you do have any questions, you can always just type them. It'll be in the GoToWebinar panel on the right. Just go ahead and chat us a question. We'll go ahead and we'll either try to answer you directly or just bring it up here just so that we can go ahead and kind of share it with the team. So one question that we had is within Axosoft, how do we work with projects and releases, and what's really the difference between the two? If Jonathan, you can explain.
Okay, yeah, sure. I like this question. So projects and releases in Axosoft. So it probably makes more sense if I hop over to my other screen. And let me get rid of the daily Scrum here. Okay, so essentially, if you're an Axosoft customer, this might be really relevant to you. A project folder is essentially just a library for you to keep all your items in there. So, and a release is just a time box. So a project does not have a due date, whereas a release does. And the whole reason that we arrange it this way is because you may have items that exist in your project folder that don't make sense to exist in a release. Maybe you aren't developing something. Maybe you have subfolders here that don't quite need to be developed by anyone. And so a project folder is just there for you to, go ahead and receive all the feature requests that are coming in. You can go ahead and rank them however you'd like. You can go ahead and archive them or get rid of them or delete them as you need. But really, you don't have to add items from the project folder into a release. They can be independent from one another. And actually, when you create a release for the first time in Axosoft, it's going to be empty. There's going to be nothing in there. And for good reason, just because we didn't put anything inside it. And so let me, for example, just do, I didn't set a start and due date, but when you create a release for the first time, there won't be anything inside it. So project folders can be independent of releases. You put items inside a release because you expect it to, be done by some certain due date. And then within Axosoft, we use releases particularly to help you track how things are going. And so one of the things that I didn't touch on, and on purpose, in the framework is the idea of burn down charts. A burn down chart is essentially a tool that folks have developed in order to keep track of, in order to communicate to the outside world how things are going. And so it is something that comes up as a result of, following the Scrum process and just, communicating how much time is left. So rather than calculating that manually, the tool allows you to do it, pretty quickly just by selecting the the release you have in question and go ahead and take a look at your progress, and you can see your projected ship date. And so I hope that answers your question. The main difference between a project folder and a release folder is that really they're two independent entities. Project folder can contain everything, and the releases can only contain what you really expect the teams to actually develop within some given time frame. And at least in Axosoft, you can always break down the releases, much like how I talked about you can break down your product backlog. I've seen some folks just make the root release here everything. It just contains everything that they want. They make it the same thing as everything that's inside the project folder. And then they'll break down the releases and the sprints to actually contain the items they expect to develop. So I hope that answers your question. Brett, what else you got?
Oh, all right. So I'm actually just going and grabbing a bunch of them by hammering them out directly as well. The next one we have is what's the role of the project manager in Agile, and is that different than a product owner?
So typically what I've seen is when folks are trying to put together a Scrum team, the temptation is to make the project manager either the Scrum Master or the product owner. So one thing here, never make the Scrum Master and the product owner the same person. It's too much power. It's not what I recommend. But if the project manager is not really an official Scrum role, and if they're not the ones who are either developing the product, if they're not the ones who will be determining the business value of the items via the product owner role, and if they're not the ones who will be guiding the team through the Scrum process, then really they're just they're a stakeholder, much like an executive would be or a manager. They are folks that are necessary in order to actually get things. The Scrum team needs resources. They may need people to be part of the team. They may need hiring resources. They may need IT resources. And so the person is really there as a resource to make sure that those impediments that come up are resolved through them. So in many ways, the Scrum Master may turn to them. I have no easy question or no easy answer for you. Just understand that there is no project manager it's not like a currency exchange, where you can get dollars to pesos pretty quickly. There's no easy place to put a project manager. They just aren't part of the Scrum team in the classic sense. Doesn't mean that you can do something different. However, they can act as someone who the Scrum team does have to. They are a stakeholder. They have to be, making sure that those needs are being met by the Scrum team. I hope that answers your question. I feel like I rambled a little bit there, but I did touch on things that hopefully address your question there.
All right. Great. So we have got another question, just asking about some companies who actually might not be software developers. So if you're not actually delivering a software product and delivering that to your customers, how you can use Scrum and Agile processes to help you out as well.
Yeah, okay, cool. That's an exciting question. So Scrum has been adapted to go beyond software development. I mean, software development is where it came from. It is the origin. However, I've seen teams try to apply, like for example, I once talked to a customer. He was a chef at, I think, Penn State, and he was trying to incorporate principles of Scrum into his kitchen. And he was actually trying to use our product too. I found that very curious. But essentially what he was trying to do is just, the menu was what he was trying to update, and his Scrum team was everyone else in the kitchen. So his chefs, his sous chef and whatnot. And so essentially what I recommend to you, I mean, these are principles. These are non-technical. These are ideas that you can take and mold to improve your own process. So for example, the product owner role, I mean, you're essentially trying to go through certain exercises that are good for you anyway. I mean, who are you trying to serve? What activities can the whole team do in order to maximize their contribution to the folks that they serve? And so going through that activity itself will help you, better focus what to spend your time on. And, your dev team, the Scrum team, really, team members, they don't have to be developers. It can be whoever is responsible for getting the sprints or the product increment done. So whatever needs to be created, those are the folks who are responsible for doing it. And so I can see how engineer teams might want to do this as well, maybe a design team. Perhaps you have a team that's comprised of mechanical engineers, an industrial engineer, electrical engineer, and you can see how it's cross-functional. All the skills are there. They're working together perhaps to build a prototype. They're getting constant feedback from the customer who is requesting whatever design has been commissioned. And so there are different ways. You don't have to. It's not limited to software development. I think it's really exciting to try to apply this in a different way. And so I definitely encourage you to take the best ideas, the ones that make the most sense, and go ahead and try to apply it to your team. I definitely kudos to you for looking into it and challenging, how things are currently running and see how you can improve that.
Uh, all right, so another question that we've had actually in a couple different forms is how do bugs actually figure into the equation? And how would you account for those within Axosoft?
Sure. So it really is up to you. I think in a perfect world, people wish that there were no bugs, but of course, that's not what's going to happen. So what you can do is as bugs come up, they're essentially going to be representing work that the team is still responsible for. And so in the beginning of the sprint, you're deciding what items must be done. And ideally, you're providing some sort of padding for bugs and just for things that you don't always expect to arise from other features that you might be trying to develop or other things that you're trying to develop. So it's not limited to bugs. Defects is another example. If you're outside of, defects applies to both software development and anything outside it as well. And so, for example, what Axosoft has decided to do, which may be, well, it's just how we've decided to do things. We set a buffer for bugs just within the sprint, but we also have a sprint just for defects. And so before we release, we break things into releases, and we break the release down into sprints. And one of those sprints is a bug fix sprint. And so that's one way of making sure that all the bugs are, hammered out before the product is released to the customer base. And so you have a couple options. You can either do a bug fix sprint, you can do a QA sprint, whatever you want to call it, or you can just include enough. You can just factor that into your capacity. The items that you take at the beginning of the sprint, maybe will be 70% of what you could typically do, but the remaining 30 is for, time that you expect to spend fixing bugs. Different ways. That's just one suggestion I have. More than welcome to, send us an email. We can always hit you up and have a conversation about that, to use my colloquial terms there.
Okay, so we've got another great question just asking about kind of like user workload and how to kind of safeguard against this. Like if you have someone that has 50 hours available, how can you see very easily within Axosoft what's assigned to them and if they've got too much or too little actually assigned to each developer?
Okay, cool. Another fun training question with Axosoft. Great. I love that a lot of you are Axosoft customers. And so hopefully you still see the screen where I have the Axosoft products shown. And so the question is, how do I know who is doing what? How do I know if someone has gone over their limit? And so first of all, we do give you the ability to, I'll stay in list view. So let me group by assigned to. So first of all, I can see what items are assigned to everyone within Sprint 3. So I have 4 resources here who are working on all the items, and I see how much time is remaining throughout all of them and through each person individually. While we don't have an individual or user-based, capacity, we do have one for the entire sprint. But this way, you can at least see how much work each person has on their plate. I can also go ahead and incorporate card view to see where their items are in the workflow. So for example, I see that Dennis has a lot of items that have been approved, but only has one in progress. And so if it's almost the end of the sprint, this would be problematic, and I can see that perhaps we need to make an adjustment. So do recall that Scrum is about inspecting and adapting. And so hopefully by communicating every day, the whole team understands that, hey, listen, I know I was assigned all these items, but based off my progress with this first item, I'm not going to be able to meet, complete X, Y, and Z. And so hopefully you're getting that information early. You're not, looking at things, 7 days before the sprint is over and understand. So always that will help hedge anything that happens. But within Axosoft, we do give you the ability to group by, to view things in card view. You can also use a dashboard gadget called the item chart, which shows how many items are in a given workflow step, and how much either time is remaining or how many of them have been done already. I can go into, if you want to send me an email about that, I can show you more things there as well. And that would be I'll give you the email towards the end of the presentation here. It's the next slide. All right, so we're reaching the end of our allotted time here. And so what I'm going to do is switch my screen to the last slide here. All right. All right, so really, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you don't get tired of my voice here, but we highly encourage you to engage us on either social media. Like I said, this webinar is recorded and it will be available on YouTube within 48 hours. We highly recommend that you subscribe to our channel if you want to be notified of when we post it so you can share it with your colleagues. Also, feel free to email us at success@axosoft.com. If you want, you can request me directly. I see that email. Anything that comes in, I see it. My name is Jonathan. I've been joined by Brett. Feel free to also tweet us. If you tweet us, we really love it, and we actually tweet back and we heart you. Same thing on Facebook. If you send us something on Facebook, we'll definitely engage with you. We love talking with our customers or just anyone who's interested in learning more about Axosoft. So again, thank you very much for joining us. My name has been Jonathan from Customer Success, joined by Brett, and we'll see you in the next webinar.